If tonight your heart feels shattered by betrayal, you're safe here. If you've been misunderstood, falsely accused, or left in a dark place you didn't deserve, this story is for you. You don't have to explain yourself right now, not in this moment. Just breathe, slowly, and let the ache in your chest begin to ease. Here in this quiet space, you are not forgotten. The Lord sees the injustice you've endured. He knows the tears you've hidden, and He is writing a story far greater than the pain you're carrying tonight. So, for a little while, let me walk with you through the life of Joseph, a boy who was loved, then hated, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused, locked away in prison, but never, not for one moment, abandoned by God. Tonight, we will journey through the book of Genesis not as a lesson, but as a gentle reminder that your suffering is not the end of your story. These words are not just ancient scripture. They are God's whisper to your weary soul saying, "What others meant for evil, I am turning into something beautiful." As you listen, may this story soften the bitterness in your heart. May it restore your faith in God's timing, and may it remind you that even in the deepest pit, His hand never lets you go. And, my dear friend, if these moments bring healing to your spirit, I gently invite you to press like and subscribe so we may continue this journey of faith and restoration together. And if you're walking through your own pit tonight, your own prison, your own betrayal, feel free to share it in the comments. You are not alone here, not before God, and not with us. If this brings you rest, I'm grateful you're here. Now, let us begin the story of Joseph, a story of pain, perseverance, and the unshakable grace of God. Tonight, let me tell you about a boy named Joseph. A boy who was deeply loved, and because of that love, deeply hated. It's strange, isn't it? How the very thing that should protect us can sometimes make us a target. How being cherished by one person can make you invisible to everyone else. If you've ever felt that ache, if you've ever been celebrated in one place only to be rejected in another, you already understand Joseph's story before we even begin. Joseph was the 11th son of Jacob, but he wasn't just another child in a crowded household. No, he was the son, the one his father's eyes searched for in the morning, the one whose voice brought a smile to Jacob's worn face at the end of a long day, the one who carried his father's heart in ways the others never could. You see, Jacob had loved Joseph's mother Rachel with a love so fierce it had cost him 14 years of labor, 14 years of sweat under the burning sun nights of aching loneliness, hands calloused from work that never seemed to end. He had worked 7 years to marry her, only to be tricked into marrying her sister Leah first. So, he worked another 7 years, because love like that doesn't give up. It endures. It waits. It pays whatever price is asked. And when Rachel finally became his wife, she was everything to him. But their joy was short-lived. Rachel struggled to have children while Leah bore son after son. The house filled with boys who looked at their father and wondered why he seemed so distant, why his love felt rationed, why he was always looking past them toward the one woman who held his heart. Then, after years of waiting and praying and heartbreak, Rachel gave birth to Joseph, and Jacob's world changed. This wasn't just another son. This was the child of the woman he loved most, the answer to her tears, the living proof that God still heard their prayers, But the story doesn't end happily. Rachel died giving birth to Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother. She died in childbirth, crying out in pain, slipping away before Jacob could save her. And Jacob was left holding the memory of her in his arms, a memory that would haunt him every day for the rest of his life. From that moment on, when Jacob looked at Joseph, he didn't just see a son. He saw Rachel's eyes. He saw her gentleness. He heard her laughter still echoing in the way Joseph moved through the world, in the way he spoke, in the kindness that seemed to come so naturally to him. So, Jacob did something that would change everything. He made Joseph a coat. Not just any coat, but a robe of many colors woven with threads of crimson and gold, deep blues, like the evening sky greens, like the hills after spring rain, purples like the wildflowers that bloomed in the valleys where Rachel used to walk. It was beautiful, extravagant, impossible to ignore. Every stitch was a declaration. Every color was a memory. And every time Joseph wore it, it announced to everyone, "This one is favored. This one is loved in a way the rest of you are not." Can you picture it? A young boy, maybe 16 or 17, walking through the fields where his brothers labored under the heat. The wind catches the edge of his robe, and it billows behind him like a banner. The colors catch the light shifting and shimmering with every step. He's not trying to show off. He's just walking. But the coat does the talking for him. His brothers see him coming, and their hands tighten around their tools. Their jaws clench. Their eyes narrow. Because they are dusty, sweating, invisible. Their clothes are plain worn-stained with the work they do every single day without recognition. And he is radiant. He is adorned. He is the walking reminder that their Father's love is not equally distributed. But here's what you need to know about Joseph. Something his brothers couldn't see. He wasn't arrogant. He wasn't cruel or mocking. He wasn't parading around trying to make them feel small. He was just young, innocent in the way that children of favor often are, unaware that love given to one can feel like love stolen from another. He didn't ask for the coat, but he wore it with the unself-conscious joy of a boy who believed his father's love was simply natural, simply the way things were supposed to be. He didn't yet understand that favor is a fire, and not everyone wants to be warmed by it. Some would rather see it extinguished. Some would rather burn the whole thing down than watch someone else bask in the light. Joseph's heart was pure. He helped with the work. He was kind to his brothers, or at least he tried to be. He brought back reports to his father about how things were going in the fields, not to tattle, but because he genuinely cared. But everything he did was filtered through the lens of resentment. Every smile was seen as smugness. Every word was heard as condescension. Every kindness was interpreted as manipulation. You know, sometimes the hardest thing about being blessed is that not everyone will celebrate it with you. Sometimes your light makes other people feel small, and they'll convince themselves that your light is the problem, that you're the one who needs to dim yourself so they can feel better. And that's not your fault, but it's still your reality. It's a lonely thing to be loved in a way that makes others look away. Joseph lived in a house filled with brothers, but he walked through it alone. They couldn't see his heart. They only saw the coat. They couldn't hear his dreams. They only heard their father's favoritism echoing in every thread. And so the distance grew day by day, like a crack widening in stone, like a wound that never quite heals. At night, when the family gathered around the fire, Joseph would sit close to his father. The firelight would dance across that beautiful coat, making the colors come alive, and Jacob would rest his hand on his son's shoulder. A quiet gesture full of unspoken love, full of all the things a father carries when he's lost the woman he loved most. In those moments, Jacob felt close to Rachel again. He felt like she was still there, still present, still part of his life. But across the fire, 11 pairs of eyes watched. They saw the hand on the shoulder. They saw the smile. They saw the coat glowing in the firelight. And in the shadows between them, in the silence of their shared bitterness, something dark began to grow. Something that would soon become too big to contain. If you've ever been the one who was loved and resented for it, if you've ever carried a gift that made others uncomfortable, then you know what Joseph felt in those quiet moments. The confusion of being celebrated by one while being quietly despised by many. The strange guilt of being chosen when you didn't ask to be. The ache of wanting to be close to your family but feeling the wall they've built between you and them. And maybe you've tried to fix it. Maybe you've tried to apologize for being favored. Tried to make yourself smaller. Tried to hide the gifts God gave you so that others wouldn't feel threatened. But it doesn't work, does it? Because the problem was never really about you. It was about them, about the wounds they were carrying, about the love they felt they never received. Breathe with me now. God doesn't apologize for the gifts He gives you. He doesn't ask permission from those who feel threatened by your favor. He clothes you not to make others jealous, but because He has a purpose that requires you to be seen even when it costs you. Even when it makes you lonely. Even when the people you love most turn their backs on you. Rest in that tonight. You are allowed to be loved even when others don't understand why. You are allowed to wear the coat He's given you even when it makes people turn away. You are allowed to be blessed without carrying the weight of everyone else's disappointment. Jacob loved Joseph not to hurt the other sons, but because he couldn't help it. And God loves you not because you're better than anyone else, but because He sees something in you, something He's planted there, something He's going to use for a purpose you can't even imagine yet. So wear the coat, carry the blessing, and trust that even when it isolates you, even when it costs you, God knows what He's doing. And then the dreams came. It started one night when Joseph was sleeping under the stars, the kind of deep, still sleep that comes after a long day in the fields. The air was cool. The night was quiet. And in that sleep, God spoke. Not in words, but in images that burned themselves into Joseph's mind with a clarity that wouldn't fade when he woke. Images so vivid, so powerful, that he would remember every detail for the rest of his life. He dreamed he was in the field with his brothers gathering grain at harvest time. The sun was warm on his back, and all around him bundles of wheat were being tied and stood upright. It was familiar work, the kind of work they did every year, the rhythm of bending and tying and stacking. Joseph bent down, gathered his own sheaf, tied it with practiced hands, and set it upright in the ground. And then something impossible happened. His sheaf stood up on its own. It didn't fall. It didn't lean. It rose tall and firm as if held by invisible hands. And one by one his brothers' sheaves began to move. They tilted slowly like heads bowing in reverence. and they gathered around Joseph's sheaf, forming a circle, and they bowed low. All 11 of them, bowing to his sheaf, bowing to him. Joseph woke with his heart pounding. The dream was so vivid, so real, that he could still feel the weight of the grain in his hands, could still smell the dust, and the earth could still see the sheaves bowing in perfect unison. He lay there in the darkness, staring up at the stars, his mind racing. Was it just a dream? Or was it something more? Was God trying to tell him something? He didn't have to wait long for an answer, because a few nights later, a second dream came. This time, the images were even grander, more majestic, more impossible to ignore. He saw the sun blazing with golden light, so bright it should have hurt to look at. The moon pale and luminous, glowing with a soft silver radiance. And 11 stars scattered across the velvet sky, each one shining with its own fire, each one beautiful and distinct. But as Joseph watched, they began to move. Slowly, gracefully, they drew closer, converging toward him, as if he were the center of some great cosmic story they were all part of. And then, one by one, they bowed. The sun bowed. The moon bowed. And all 11 stars inclined themselves toward him, as if acknowledging something he couldn't yet understand, something written into the fabric of the universe before he was even born. When Joseph woke this time, he was breathless. His hands were trembling. His whole body was alive with the sense that something monumental had just happened. Because deep in his spirit, he knew this wasn't just his imagination. This wasn't just a random dream. This was God showing him something. A glimpse of a future he couldn't yet comprehend, a destiny woven into his life. A purpose that was bigger than anything he'd ever imagined. But here's the thing about divine dreams, about the visions God plants in our hearts. They're not always easy to carry. Sometimes God shows you where you're going before he shows you how you'll get there. Sometimes he plants a seed of promise in your heart and then asks you to wait and trust and endure seasons that seem to contradict everything he showed you. Sometimes the dream becomes the heaviest thing you'll ever carry. Joseph didn't understand that yet. He was 17, full of wonder, his heart still soft and open, still innocent enough to believe that everyone would be as excited about God's promises as he was. He thought naively that his family would celebrate with him, that they'd be amazed by what God was showing him, that they'd gather around and say, "Tell us more. What does it mean?" So he did what any young, sincere boy would do. He told his brothers. He gathered them one morning, his eyes still bright with the memory of the dreams, his voice filled with excitement. And he said, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." The words hung in the air, and for a moment there was silence. A heavy, dangerous silence. His brothers stared at him, and Joseph in his innocence didn't see the storm gathering at their eyes. He didn't see their jaws tightening, their hands curling into fists, their faces hardening like stone. "Do you intend to reign over us?" One of them said, his voice sharp with anger, cutting through the air like a blade. "Will you actually rule us?" And from that moment, they hated him even more. The dream that was meant to be a promise became a weapon they used against him. Every time they looked at him after that, they saw not their brother, but their future oppressor. They saw someone who thought he was better than them, someone who wanted to lord his favor over them, someone who needed to be put in his place. Then, a few days later, Joseph made it worse. He told them the second dream. "I had another dream," he said, still not seeing the danger, still believing in the goodness of what God had shown him. "This time, the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." Even his father rebuked him this time. Jacob's face grew stern, his voice sharp in a way Joseph had rarely heard. "What is this dream you had?" he said. "Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" It was too much, too bold, too arrogant sounding even to the man who loved him most. But while his brothers seethed with jealousy, while they whispered among themselves and plotted in the shadows, Jacob kept the matter in his heart. Because somewhere deep inside, beneath the shock and the discomfort, he wondered, could this be true? Could God really have chosen this boy for something so great? Could there be a future where Joseph would rise above them all, not out of pride, but out of divine purpose? Jacob had seen God do impossible things before. He'd wrestled with an angel and walked away with a limp and a blessing. He'd seen God multiply his flocks when Laban tried to cheat him. He'd experienced grace upon grace in his own messy, complicated life. So even though the dream sounded outrageous, even though it seemed to defy everything natural and right, he tucked it away in his heart and waited to see what God would do. But his brothers had no such patience, no such faith. They heard the dream and felt only rage, because to them this wasn't a promise from God. This was Joseph's arrogance laid bare. This was proof that he thought he was better than them, that he wanted to rule over them, that he needed to be stopped before his delusions got any bigger. You know, there's a painful irony in Joseph's story. God gave him dreams, beautiful, powerful, world-changing dreams. But those dreams became the very thing that turned his brothers against him. The promise became the problem. The blessing became the curse. The thing that should have united them instead drove a wedge so deep it would almost destroy them all. And if you've ever felt that, if God has ever shown you something beautiful about your future, only to have people mock it, dismiss it, belittle it, or resent you for it, then you understand what Joseph was walking into. You understand the confusion of carrying a promise that no one else believes. You understand the loneliness of seeing a future that everyone else thinks is foolish. Sometimes the gift God gives you is the very thing that isolates you. Sometimes His favor feels more like a burden than a blessing. Sometimes you wish He'd never shown you anything at all, because now you're carrying something that makes you an outcast in your own family. But listen to me closely. Joseph didn't know it yet, but those dreams weren't just about his future. They weren't just about power or position or prestige. They were about survival. They were about a famine that would come, a family that would need saving, and a boy who would become the bridge between death and life for an entire nation. God was showing Joseph the destination, but He wasn't showing him the road, and the road would be darker and harder than Joseph could possibly imagine. But the dreams were true. Every word, every image, every impossible promise. And one day, when Joseph stood in Pharaoh's court with the power to save or destroy when his brothers bowed before him without knowing who he was, he would remember these dreams and understand that God had been preparing him all along. So, if you're carrying a dream tonight that no one believes, If you're holding a promise that makes people laugh or roll their eyes or turn away, hold on to it. Write it down. Keep it close. Because God doesn't plant dreams in your heart to mock you. He plants them to prepare you for the moment when everything He promised will come to pass. Jealousy is a strange and quiet poison. It doesn't announce itself with a loud crash or a sudden explosion. It seeps in slowly, like water, finding cracks in a foundation, working its way deeper and deeper, until one day the whole structure collapses and everyone wonders how it happened. Joseph's brothers didn't wake up one morning and decide to hate him. No, it started small, almost imperceptibly. A glance held too long. A comment left unsaid. A moment when their father praised Joseph and they felt the sting of being overlooked, the familiar ache of not being enough. It grew every time Jacob called Joseph's name with a tenderness he never used with them. Every time that coat of many colors caught the light and reminded them of what they didn't have. Every time Joseph spoke of his dreams with that innocent confidence, as if he didn't realize he was rubbing salt in their wounds, as if he couldn't see the pain etched into their faces. They were his brothers. They had grown up together, shared the same tents, eaten from the same table, played the same games as children. But somewhere along the way, love curdled into resentment. And resentment hardened into something darker, something that whispered in the night and plotted in the shadows and waited for an opportunity. You see, jealousy isn't really about the other person. It's about the painful gap between what they have and what you feel you deserve. It's about looking at someone else's blessing and feeling the sharp ache of your own emptiness, your own lack, your own invisibility. Joseph's brothers weren't just angry at him. They were angry at their father for choosing him, for loving him in a way they could never earn, no matter how hard they worked. They were angry at God for giving him dreams, for marking him as special, for setting him apart. And they were angry at themselves, angry that they weren't enough, angry that they would always be second best, angry that the world seemed to revolve around this one boy in his ridiculous coat. And so they stopped speaking to him. The Bible says they could not speak a kind word to him. Think about that. They couldn't even be civil. They couldn't even manage basic human decency. When Joseph walked into a room, conversations would stop. When he smiled, they looked away. When he tried to help, they refused. They built walls around their hearts, brick by brick, and Joseph stood on the outside, confused and alone, wondering what he had done wrong. He would try to join them in the fields, and they would turn their backs. He would offer to help with the work, and they would tell him to go away. He would sit by the fire at night, and they would talk around him as if he weren't there, as if he were invisible, as if he didn't exist. And the worst part, Joseph didn't understand why. He didn't understand that his very existence was a wound to them, that his favor was a reminder of their rejection, that every breath he took felt like something stolen from them. But here's the truth, that Joseph's brothers couldn't see the truth that jealousy always blinds us to. Favor isn't about worthiness. God doesn't choose people because they're better or smarter or more deserving. He chooses them because He has a purpose, and sometimes that purpose requires one person to carry a weight the others aren't meant to bear. Joseph wasn't better than his brothers. He wasn't more righteous or more faithful or more worthy of love. He was just chosen for something different. And that difference, that distinction, was more than they could bear. Because when you feel unloved, when you feel passed over, when you feel like you've spent your whole life working for crumbs while someone else gets the feast, it's almost impossible to celebrate their success. The brothers watched Joseph every day, and their resentment grew like a living thing. They would lie awake at night, replaying his words, imagining scenarios where they put him in his place, fantasizing about the day when the tables would turn, and he would know what it felt like to be nothing. They told themselves stories about him. He's arrogant. He's a liar. He thinks he's better than us. He's manipulating Father. He's trying to steal our inheritance. None of it was true, but they believed it because they needed to. Because if Joseph was the villain, then their hatred was justified. If he was the problem, then they weren't responsible for the bitterness eating them alive. And Jacob. He saw the tension, but he didn't know what to do about it. How could he stop loving Joseph just to make the others feel better? How could he turn off his heart, his grief, his memories of Rachel? So he did nothing. He kept Joseph close and let the others simmer in their resentment, and the whole family slowly fractured under the weight of unspoken pain. If you're the one wearing the coat tonight, if you're the one carrying a dream that no one else understands, let me speak gently to your heart. It's okay to feel the weight of being misunderstood. It's okay to wish that the people you love could celebrate you instead of resenting you. It's okay to wonder why God's blessing sometimes feels so lonely, why favor sometimes feels like a curse. But don't apologize for the gift He's given you. Don't shrink yourself to make others comfortable. Don't hide your light because someone else is choosing to stay in the dark. Don't spend your life trying to earn the approval of people who have decided they don't want to give it. God knew what He was doing when He gave you that dream. He knew it would cost you something. He knew it would set you apart. He knew it would make some people turn away, and He gave it to you anyway, not because He's cruel, but because He trusts you to carry it. Because He sees something in you that's worth the price. And if you're the one looking at someone else's coat tonight, if you're feeling that familiar ache of jealousy rising in your chest, that bitter taste of, why them and not me, let me speak gently to you too. Their blessing is not your curse. Their favor doesn't mean you are forgotten. Their dream doesn't cancel out yours. God has something for you too. Something woven into the fabric of your own story. Something that doesn't require you to tear someone else down to receive it. There is enough. Enough love. Enough purpose. Enough room in God's heart for all of His children to be seen, to be cherished, to be chosen for the specific thing He's called them to do. You don't have to compete. You don't have to compare. You don't have to let someone else's light convince you that yours is dim. Joseph's brothers couldn't see that. They looked at his coat and saw their own rejection. They heard his dreams and felt their own smallness. And because they couldn't see past their pain, they were about to do something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But we're not there yet. For now, we're still in the moment before everything falls apart. The moment when jealousy is just a seed, when hatred is just a thought, when the family is still intact, even if it's breaking at the seams. Breathe with me now. The night is quiet. The day's burdens are fading. And in this stillness, God is here closer than your own heartbeat whispering, "You are mine. You are seen. You are loved." Whether you're wearing the coat or wishing you were, whether you're dreaming God's dreams or struggling to understand them whether you're the favorite or the forgotten. He is with you. He sees you. He knows your name. And he is not finished with your story yet. Not by a long way. Rest now. Let your heart be still. Let the weight of comparison fall away. Let the ache of misunderstanding soften. You are exactly where you're meant to be. And God is not finished with your story yet. The dreams are real. The favor is real. The purpose is real. And so is the pain. But the pain is not the end. It's just the beginning. Amen. One morning, Jacob called Joseph to him. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and pink. It should have been a beautiful day. It should have been ordinary. But nothing about this day would be ordinary, though neither of them knew it yet. Your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Jacob said, his voice gentle, his hand resting on Joseph's shoulder the way it always did. Go and see if all is well with them and with the flocks, and bring word back to me. It was a simple request. A father worried about his sons. A father wanting news from the fields. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. Joseph nodded. I'll go, he said, his voice steady, trusting. Because why wouldn't he trust his father? Why wouldn't he go where he was sent? So he put on his coat, that beautiful coat of many colors, the one that marked him as beloved, the one that had become a lightning rod for everything his brothers felt but couldn't say. And he set out across the hills alone, walking toward the brothers who hated him. If you've ever been sent into a situation where you weren't wanted, where your presence alone was enough to trigger anger, you understand what Joseph was walking into. If you've ever been naive enough to believe that blood would protect you, that family meant safety, that love would win in the end, you understand the terrible innocence of this moment. Joseph walked for miles, his sandals kicking up dust, his coat catching the wind. He asked directions from strangers. He kept going even when he couldn't find his brothers in Shechem, even when someone told him they'd moved on to Dothan. He kept going because his father had asked him to, because he believed his brothers, despite everything, were still his brothers. But in Dothan, his brothers saw him coming from a distance. That coat, always that coat visible, even from far away. A splash of color against the brown and green of the fields, a reminder walking toward them. A problem they'd been waiting for an excuse to solve. Here comes that dreamer. One of them said, his voice dripping with contempt. And something shifted in the air, something dark and final. Come now, let's kill him. Another said the words falling like stones into still water. We can throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. Kill him, just like that, as if it were nothing. As if ending a life, ending their brother's life, was a reasonable solution to their bitterness. And the terrifying thing is, they meant it. They weren't joking. They weren't venting. They were planning. They were ready. Years of resentment had built up like dry wood, and now all it took was one spark, one moment, and it was ready to burn. But Reuben, the oldest, heard them and felt something twist in his chest. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the faint echo of conscience that hadn't been completely silenced yet. Let's not take his life, he said quickly. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. He was trying to save Joseph, trying to buy time so he could come back later and rescue him. But he didn't know that even good intentions can pave the road to hell. He didn't know that delaying murder isn't the same as preventing it. Joseph came closer, smiling, probably expecting nothing. Maybe he was relieved to finally find them. Maybe he was already composing his report in his mind, planning what he'd tell his father when he got home. And then they were on him, hands grabbing, voices shouting, the coat being ripped from his body, the beautiful coat his father made with love, torn away like it meant nothing. Joseph must have been confused at first, thinking maybe it was a joke, a rough game, something that would end in laughter. But it didn't end in laughter. They stripped him, they dragged him, and they threw him into a cistern, a deep, empty pit carved into the rock, a place meant to hold water, but now holding only darkness and despair. You know the deepest betrayal always comes from the people closest to you. Strangers can hurt you, yes, but it's a different kind of pain. It's expected. It's survivable. But when the people who are supposed to love you, who share your blood, your history, your home, when they turn on you, it breaks something inside that's hard to ever fully repair. Joseph didn't see it coming. How could he? These were his brothers. They'd grown up together. They'd eaten together. They'd slept under the same stars. And now they were throwing him away like garbage. The cruelty of it, the coldness, the speed with which love can turn to violence when resentment is left to fester long enough. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, if you've ever had your world turned upside down by the people who were supposed to protect you, then you know the shock that must have hit Joseph as he fell. The confusion, the disbelief, the desperate hope that this couldn't really be happening. But it was happening, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The fall was quick. One moment, Joseph was standing in the sunlight surrounded by his brothers, and the next he was tumbling through the air arms, flailing, trying to catch himself, trying to understand. And then he hit the bottom. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs. Pain shot through his body, and for a moment everything went black. Not just the darkness of the pit, but the darkness of shock, of trauma, of a mind trying to process something too terrible to understand. When he came to, he was lying on cold, damp stone. The cistern was narrow, carved deep into the rock, maybe 20 feet down, maybe more. The walls were steep and smooth, impossible to climb. And above him a small circle of sky, impossibly far away, like looking up from the bottom of a well. He tried to stand. His legs shook. His body ached. But worse than the physical pain was the realization settling over him like a suffocating blanket. They threw me in here. My brothers. They threw me away. He called out. His voice echoed against the stone walls, hollow and desperate. Help. Please. Let me out. But there was no answer. Or worse, there was laughter. The sound of his brothers above, sitting down to eat, casual and unconcerned as if they hadn't just destroyed someone's life. The Bible says they sat down to eat a meal. Think about that. They threw their brother into a pit and then sat down to eat. They could hear him crying, begging, pleading, and they bit into their bread and drank their water and acted as if nothing was wrong. How do you do that? How do you silence your conscience so completely that another person's suffering becomes background noise to your lunch? But they did. Because when you dehumanize someone, when you convince yourself that they're the enemy, that they deserve it, that they're not really your brother anymore, it becomes possible to do unspeakable things. Joseph was alone in that darkness, completely, utterly alone. The light above him was fading as the sun moved across the sky. Soon it would be night. Soon, even that small circle of light would disappear, and he would be left in total blackness. Have you ever been in that kind of darkness? Not just physical darkness, but the darkness of abandonment, of hopelessness, of feeling like God Himself has forgotten you. The darkness where you can't see a way forward, can't imagine how things could ever be okay again. Can't find even a sliver of light to hold on to. Joseph was 17 years old. Just a boy, really, and he was at the bottom of a pit, betrayed by his own family, with no idea if he would ever see the sun again. He cried. Of course he cried. His voice grew hoarse from calling out. His throat burned. His eyes stung with tears that no one would wipe away. And slowly, as the hours passed, the crying turned to whimpering, and the whimpering turned to silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of someone who's run out of words, run out of hope, run out of strength to fight. The cistern was cold. At night, the temperature would drop, and Joseph, stripped of his coat, had nothing to warm him. Just the stone beneath him, hard and unforgiving, and the darkness pressing in from all sides. It's strange, isn't it? How darkness can feel like a physical thing. How it can press against your chest, fill your lungs, make it hard to breathe. Joseph was surrounded by stone, but the worst prison was in his mind. The place where questions circle endlessly with no answers. Why? Why did they hate me so much? What did I do wrong? Was it the dreams? Was it the coat? Was it just that Father loved me? Is love really something worth killing for? And underneath all those questions, the one that hurt most of all. Where is God? God had given him those dreams. God had shown him a future where he was honored, where his family bowed before him, where he mattered. But now he was in a pit, discarded, forgotten, and the dreams felt like a cruel joke. If you're in a pit tonight, if you're in a place so dark you can't see your own hand in front of your face, if you're wondering where God is and why He isn't rescuing you, let me tell you something true. He's there. He's there in the darkness with you. He hasn't left. He hasn't forgotten. Even when you can't feel Him, even when the silence is so loud it drowns out everything else, He is there. The pit is not the end of the story. The darkness is not where you'll stay forever. This is not your destination. It's just a terrible, painful stop along the way. Joseph didn't know that. He couldn't see it. All he could see was darkness. All he could feel was cold. All he knew was that he was alone and abandoned, and the dreams that once filled him with hope now felt like lies. But God was already at work, even in that pit, even in that moment of utter despair. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning in a way Joseph never could have imagined. So, if you're in the pit tonight, breathe with me. Let the darkness be what it is. Don't fight it. Don't pretend it's not there. But don't believe it's forever either. The pit is deep, but God is deeper still. Joseph didn't know how long he'd been in the pit. Time loses meaning in the dark. Hours feel like days. Minutes stretch into eternities. But eventually he heard voices above. His brothers were talking, and they weren't alone. A caravan was passing by. Ishmaelite traders, their camels loaded with spices and goods, heading south toward Egypt. The sound of bells and hooves, the murmur of foreign voices, the smell of incense and myrrh drifting down into the pit. And then Judah spoke. What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. Sell him, not save him, not pull him out and apologize and bring him home. Sell him, turn him into profit, turn a brother into merchandise. And his brothers agreed. They pulled Joseph out of the pit. For a moment he must have hoped. Maybe they'd change their minds. Maybe they were letting him go. Maybe this nightmare was over. But then he saw the traders, saw the ropes, saw the coins changing hands. 20 shekels of silver. That's what they sold him for. 20 pieces of metal, the price of a slave, the price of betraying everything family was supposed to mean. They bound his hands. They put him in the line with the other slaves people whose lives had also been reduced to a transaction, whose futures were now owned by someone else. And Joseph looked back at his brothers one last time. Maybe he tried to speak. Maybe he tried to plead. Maybe he just looked at them, his eyes asking the question his voice couldn't form. How could you? But they didn't meet his gaze. They took their silver and turned away. They couldn't look at him, couldn't face what they'd done. Because even the hardest heart has moments where the truth breaks through, where you catch a glimpse of yourself and realize you've become something you never meant to be. So they walked away, and Joseph was led away in chains. The caravan moved slowly through the wilderness, heading south. The sun beat down mercilessly during the day, turning the sand into fire. At night, the temperature plummeted, and Joseph, still without his coat, shivered in the cold. His wrists were raw from the ropes. His feet bled from walking. His throat was parched from thirst. But worse than any physical pain was the weight of what had happened, the reality sinking in with every step. I'm a slave. My brother sold me. I'm never going home. I'll never see my father again. Everything I knew, everything I had, everyone I loved, it's gone. Can you imagine? One day, you're your father's beloved son, wearing a coat of many colors, dreaming dreams from God. The next day, you're in chains, walking toward a foreign land, stripped of your name, your identity, your freedom. The traders didn't care who he was. They didn't care about his dreams. To them, he was just inventory, just a body to be sold in the markets of Egypt. Just another young man whose life could be bought and used and discarded when he was no longer useful. As they traveled, Joseph would have seen the landscape change, the familiar hills of Canaan giving way to the stark beauty of the desert, sand stretching endlessly in every direction, the occasional oasis palm trees clustered around water, offering brief respite before the journey continued. At night, the caravan would stop and make camp. Fires would be lit. Food would be shared, though Joseph would get only scraps. And he would lie on the ground, looking up at the stars, the same stars he used to see from his father's tents, and wonder if he would ever see home again. Do you know what it's like to be torn away from everything you know? To have your whole world collapse in a single day? To wake up and realize that the life you had is gone, and there's no going back, no undoing what's been done. Joseph knew. He lived it. Every step toward Egypt was a step away from the boy he used to be. But here's what he didn't know, what he couldn't see, what God was quietly orchestrating, even as Joseph's heart was breaking. Egypt wasn't his grave. It was his training ground. The pit wasn't his end. It was his beginning. The betrayal wasn't God's absence. It was God's plan unfolding in a way that would save not just Joseph, but his entire family, the family that had thrown him away. But Joseph didn't know that yet. All he knew was loss. All he felt was pain. All he could see was the endless road ahead and the chains on his wrists. The traders finally arrived in Egypt, the land of pyramids and pharaohs, of strange gods and stranger customs. A place where Joseph didn't speak the language, didn't know the rules, didn't have a single friend or ally. They took him to the slave market, put him on a platform with others, let buyers inspect him like livestock, checking his teeth, his muscles, his health, reducing him to flesh and bone, stripping away every last shred of dignity. And someone bought him. A man named Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh, captain of the guard. A powerful man in a powerful position. Joseph was taken to Potiphar's house, given new clothes, though nothing like the coat he'd lost, assigned work, told what to do and when to do it. And slowly, painfully, he began to understand that this was his life now. No more father's love, no more coat of many colors, no more dreams of grandeur, just work, just survival, just the long hard road of starting over in a place where no one knew his name and no one cared. If you've ever lost everything, if you've ever had to start over from nothing, if you've ever felt like your past was erased and your future was stolen, then you know what Joseph felt in those early days in Egypt. The grief, the anger, the crushing weight of injustice, the questions that have no answers, the prayers that feel like they bounce off the ceiling, the silence of God when you need Him most. But here's what I need you to hear tonight. When people throw you away, God picks you up. When doors close behind you, He's already opening doors ahead of you. When everything you knew is gone, He's building something new, something you can't see yet, something that will make sense one day, even though it makes no sense now. Joseph couldn't see it, but God was with him, in the pit, on the road, in the slave market, in Potiphar's house. The Lord was with Joseph. Those words, that simple phrase repeated throughout his story, are the key to everything. Not that Joseph's life was easy, not that he didn't suffer, not that he wasn't betrayed and abandoned and broken, but that God never left him. And God hasn't left you either. No matter how deep the pit, no matter how long the road, no matter how dark the night, you are not alone. You are not forgotten. You are not without hope. The dreams are still true. The promise still stands. The story isn't over. Rest now. Let your body relax. Let your mind be still. Let your heart release the weight it's been carrying. You've walked a long road today. You've carried heavy things. You've faced hard truths. But you're still here. You're still breathing. You're still standing. And that means there's still a future. There's still a purpose. There's still a God who sees you and knows your name and is writing a story with your life that's bigger than any pit, any betrayal, any road that leads you away from home. Close your eyes. Let the darkness be gentle tonight. Let it be a place of rest, not fear. Let it be the quiet space where God does His deepest work, where He heals what's broken and builds what's new. You are loved. You are held. You are not abandoned. And tomorrow when the sun rises, you'll take another step, and then another. And slowly, one day at a time, you'll see that the pit wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Amen. Joseph stood in Potiphar's courtyard for the first time. And he didn't know that this place would become his second home. not because he chose it, but because God had already chosen it for him. You know there are places you don't pick for yourself, places that feel wrong at first, places that seem like punishment. But God is already there, waiting, preparing something you can't see yet. Joseph didn't want to be in Egypt. He wanted to be home, with his father, wearing that coat of many colors, living in the dreams God had given him. But here he was, in a foreign land, in a stranger's house, wearing a slave's clothes, carrying a slave's burden. The first days must have been the hardest. Everything was unfamiliar. The language sounded strange in his ears. The food tasted different. The customs confused him. Even the air smelled wrong. Spices he'd never encountered. Incense from temples to gods he didn't worship. The thick humidity of Egypt settling on his skin like a second layer. He probably woke up every morning for weeks expecting to be back in Canaan, expecting to hear his father's voice calling him, expecting the nightmare to be over. But then his eyes would open, and he'd see the ceiling of the servants' quarters, hear the Egyptian voices around him, feel the reality settle back onto his chest like a stone. This is real. This is my life now. There's no going back. If you've ever woken up to a reality you didn't choose, if you've ever had to accept that the life you knew is gone, and this new, unwanted life is what you have now, then you understand those first moments of Joseph's days. The grief that comes in waves, the disorientation, the exhaustion of constantly translating your old world into this new one. But here's what Joseph did, and here's what made all the difference. He didn't just survive. He didn't just go through the motions. He didn't let bitterness turn him into someone hard and cold. He worked, not because he had to. Well, yes, he had to. But he worked with something more than obligation. He worked with excellence, with integrity, with a quiet dignity that couldn't be stripped away by circumstances. And people noticed. Potiphar noticed. This young Hebrew slave. There was something different about him. The way he carried himself, the way he handled responsibilities, the way things just seemed to work when he was involved. The Bible says it so simply, but so powerfully. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. Not successful because everything was easy, not successful because he had advantages, but successful because God's presence was on him like an invisible hand, guiding, blessing, opening doors that should have stayed closed to a slave. Potiphar saw it, even though he didn't understand it. Even though he worshipped different gods and had no concept of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he could see that something was working in Joseph's favor. So he started giving Joseph more responsibility. Small things at first, managing the household supplies, overseeing other servants, keeping records. And Joseph handled it all with the same quiet excellence. Nothing was too small for him to do well. Nothing was beneath him. Nothing was done halfway. If you've ever had to start over at the bottom, if you've ever had to prove yourself in a place where no one knew your name or your worth, then you know how tempting it is to do just enough to get by. To save your best for when people appreciate it, to hold back until circumstances are better, to let resentment make you mediocre. But Joseph didn't do that. He gave his best to a master who owned him, in a country that had enslaved him, in a situation he never asked for. And that's the mystery of faithfulness, That's the paradox of God's economy. The very act of giving your best in the worst circumstances becomes the seed of your future breakthrough. Time passed. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. And slowly, so slowly, that Joseph probably didn't even notice it happening, Potiphar's trust grew. He gave Joseph authority over his entire household, everything he owned, every servant, every possession, every business dealing. The Bible says Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Think about that. A powerful Egyptian official, a captain of Pharaoh's guard, trusted a Hebrew slave so completely that he literally stopped worrying about his own affairs. That's not normal. That doesn't happen by accident. That's the fingerprint of God, the quiet miracle of divine favor, the kind of blessing that doesn't announce itself with trumpets but changes everything nonetheless. And here's what I need you to understand tonight. As you lie here, as you breathe slowly, as you let your body sink into rest, where God is, there is blessing. Not always the blessing you expected, not always the blessing you asked for, but blessing nonetheless. Joseph was still a slave. Let's be clear about that. He didn't stop being a slave just because he was successful. The chains were still there. The lack of freedom was still real. The injustice of his situation hadn't changed. But within that injustice, within those constraints, within the limitations imposed by other people's cruelty, God was working. God was blessing. God was preparing. You might be in a situation tonight that you didn't choose, a job you don't love, a relationship that's difficult, a season of life that feels like slavery even if that's not the word you'd use. You might feel overlooked, undervalued, stuck in a place that's beneath what you know you're capable of, and you're wondering, where is God in this? Why am I here? When will things change? But let me whisper this truth to you as gently as I can. God is with you right now, not waiting for you somewhere in the future, not disappointed in you for being where you are, but with you, in this moment, in this place, working something you can't see yet. The question isn't whether God is present. The question is whether you'll work with excellence anyway, whether you'll stay faithful anyway, whether you'll give your best even when no one's watching or applauding or noticing. Joseph worked in Potiphar's house for years before anything dramatic happened. Years of the same routines, the same responsibilities, the same quiet obedience to a master who had bought him. It must have been tempting to think the dreams were dead, that God had forgotten, that this was just his life now and nothing more. But God was building something in those years, character that couldn't be rushed, integrity that had to be tested in the ordinary, faithfulness that would be needed for what was coming. Because you see, before Joseph could handle a kingdom, he had to handle a household. Before he could be trusted with a nation's resources, he had to be trusted with one man's wealth. Before he could save his family and his people, he had to learn how to serve with excellence, even when it cost him everything and gave him nothing in return. So tonight, let your breathing slow, let your muscles relax, let the tension drain from your shoulders, your jaw, your hands. You don't have to figure everything out right now. You don't have to see the whole path. You just have to take the next step, do the next task, be faithful in the next small thing. God is with you, just like He was with Joseph. And where God is, even in the hard places, even in the unwanted places, even in the places that feel like exile, there is purpose, there is blessing. There's a future being built that you can't see yet, but God is orchestrating with perfect timing and perfect love. Rest now, knowing that faithfulness in the small things is never wasted, that God sees every effort, every moment of integrity, every choice to do right when it would be easier to do less. You are not forgotten. You are not overlooked. You are exactly where you need to be, and God is with you there. Success has a way of bringing new challenges, doesn't it? You finally get to a place where things are working, where you're trusted, where you're valued. And then something else comes along to test you in a completely different way. For Joseph, that something was Potiphar's wife. The Bible doesn't tell us her name, which is probably intentional, because this isn't really a story about her as a person. It's a story about temptation, about the kind of test that happens in secret, about the choices we make when no one else will ever know. She noticed Joseph. Of course she did. He was young. He was handsome. The Bible specifically says he was well-built and handsome. And there was something about him that drew attention. Maybe it was his integrity. Maybe it was his quiet confidence. Maybe it was just his presence. But she noticed, and what started as noticing turned into something darker, something more insistent. One day she approached him, not subtly, not with hints or suggestions, but directly. "Come to bed with me," she said, just like that. No preamble, no romance, just a blunt proposition from a powerful woman to a slave who had no power to refuse without consequences. And here's where the story gets interesting. Here's where we see what Joseph was really made of, because he could have said yes. Think about it. He was a slave. She was his master's wife. She had all the power. If he refused her, she could make his life miserable, or worse. If he agreed, he could gain favor, protection, maybe even more privileges. No one would know. It would be their secret. And in a culture where slaves had no rights anyway, who would blame him? But Joseph said no. And the reason he gave, listen to this carefully. The reason wasn't about getting caught. It wasn't about consequences or reputation or even self-preservation. He said, "How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God, against God? Not against Potiphar, though he mentioned that too. Not against himself, but against God." Even in a moment of private temptation, even when no one else would see, even when the cost of obedience was so high, Joseph's first thought was about God. That's integrity. That's the kind of character that gets built in years of faithfulness when no one's watching. That's the kind of foundation that holds when everything else gives way. But she didn't stop. This is what the Bible makes clear. She didn't ask once and then move on when he refused. She asked again, and again, and again. Day after day, she pursued him, pressured him, used her position and her power to try to break down his resistance. Can you imagine every single day going to work knowing you're going to face the same temptation, the same pressure, the same woman who won't take no for an answer? It would wear you down, wouldn't it? That's what makes temptation so dangerous. Not the one dramatic moment, but the daily erosion, the constant drip of opportunity and justification and rationalization. Just this once. No one will know. You deserve something good after all you've been through. It doesn't really matter. God will understand. Joseph must have been exhausted. Physically, yes, from managing an entire household, but emotionally too, from constantly having to defend himself, from constantly having to say no, from constantly having to navigate a situation where the wrong move could cost him everything. If you've ever been in a situation where you're being pressured to compromise, where someone keeps pushing and won't respect your boundaries, where doing the right thing makes your life harder instead of easier, then you know what Joseph was living with. The fatigue of it, the loneliness of it, the temptation to just give in so the pressure will stop. But here's what I want you to see. Here's what's so beautiful and so challenging about Joseph's response. He didn't try to manage the temptation. He didn't think he could handle it. Didn't think he could keep saying no indefinitely. Didn't trust his own strength to resist forever. He avoided her. The Bible says he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. He physically stayed away, changed his routines, made sure he wasn't alone with her, put distance between himself and the situation. That's wisdom. That's not weakness. That's strength. Strength isn't proving you can resist anything. Strength is knowing your limits and protecting yourself before you reach them. Then came the day when he couldn't avoid her anymore. He was in the house, doing his work, and no one else was around. She had orchestrated it, planned it, made sure they would be alone. And she grabbed him, physically grabbed his cloak, and said again, "Come to bed with me." The moment of crisis, the moment where everything hangs in the balance, the moment where you have to choose and there's no more time to think or plan or prepare. What Joseph did next is one of the most powerful images in the entire Bible. He ran. He didn't explain, didn't argue, didn't try to reason with her or talk his way out. He left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. He literally ran away from sin, even though it cost him, even though leaving his cloak behind would become evidence against him, even though running looked like guilt to anyone who didn't know the truth. Sometimes faithfulness looks like running. Sometimes integrity means losing something. Your reputation, your position, your comfort, rather than losing your soul. Joseph ran, and in that moment of running he chose God over everything else, over safety, over success, over the life he'd carefully built in Potiphar's house. He chose purity over pragmatism, character over convenience, and he had no idea what it would cost him. But here's the thing about temptation. Here's what we need to understand as we lie here in the quiet. Temptation always promises you something it can't deliver. It promises pleasure without consequences, satisfaction without cost, fulfillment without sacrifice. But it's lying. Every single time it's lying. What Potiphar's wife offered Joseph was momentary, fleeting, empty. What Joseph protected by saying no was eternal, lasting, real. His integrity, his relationship with God, his character that would carry him through everything else that was coming. And I know it doesn't feel that way in the moment. In the moment, the temptation feels real and the reward for faithfulness feels distant and uncertain. In the moment, doing the wrong thing seems easier, and doing the right thing seems impossibly hard. But you're not living just for the moment. You're not building a life that lasts only as long as today. You're building something that has to hold. something that has to stand, something that will be tested again and again, and needs to be strong enough to bear the weight. So, if you're facing temptation tonight, if there's something pulling at you in the quiet, if there's a compromise that seems harmless, or a boundary that seems too rigid, or a voice that keeps saying, "It doesn't matter, no one will know," let me tell you what Joseph understood. It matters. It always matters. Not because God is waiting to punish you, not because you have to earn His love through perfect obedience, but because your character is the foundation everything else is built on. When that foundation cracks, when integrity is compromised, everything built on top of it becomes unstable. Joseph knew that. He knew that some things aren't worth the cost, no matter how appealing they seem, no matter how much pressure there is to give in. And here's the mystery. Here's the part that doesn't make sense until much later. The very faithfulness that cost him everything in that moment was the faithfulness that saved him in the end. Because the same integrity that made him refuse Potiphar's wife was the integrity that would make Pharaoh trust him with a kingdom. The same character that was tested in secret was the character that would be revealed in public. God was watching, even when no one else was. God was seeing, God was taking note, and God was preparing Joseph for something bigger than anything he could imagine. But first, he had to pass this test, this quiet, private test where the only witness was God, and the only reward was a clear conscience and a pure heart. Let your breathing deepen now. Let your body settle. Let the weight of the day drain away. You don't have to fight every battle tonight. You don't have to resist every temptation in this moment. You just have to rest in the knowledge that God sees. God knows. God is with you in the secret places where you're being tested. And when you choose Him, even when it costs you, even when it looks like loss, you're building something that can't be shaken. You're protecting something more valuable than gold. You're becoming someone who can be trusted with more than you can hold right now. Rest in that truth. Rest in the knowledge that purity isn't punishment. It's protection. That boundaries aren't barriers to joy. They're the framework for real freedom. God is not asking you to miss out. He's asking you to wait for what's real, what's lasting, what's worth the cost of saying no to everything else. Sleep now, knowing that every no to temptation is a yes to something better. Every moment of faithfulness is a seed planted for a harvest you haven't seen yet. She still had his cloak in her hand, that piece of fabric, the evidence of his flight, the proof that he'd been there and then ran away. And in her hand it became a weapon, a lie she could wield, a story she could tell that would destroy him. When the other servants came back, when her husband came home, she showed them the cloak and she wove a tale of attempted assault. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me," she said. "But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." A complete inversion of the truth. The victim became the aggressor. The one who fled became the one who attacked. And Joseph, who had done everything right, who had protected his integrity at great cost, became the criminal in the story. You know what's devastating about false accusation. It's not just that it's unfair, though it is. It's not just that it's painful, though it is. It's that you can't defend yourself against it. when someone lies about you, when they twist the truth, when they use your very virtue against you, what can you say? What can you do? Joseph could have protested, could have told his side, could have argued and explained and tried to make them understand. But who would believe a slave over a master's wife? Who would take his word against hers? The system wasn't built for his truth to matter. The power dynamics weren't in his favor. His innocence was irrelevant in a world where her word carried weight and his carried none. Potiphar was furious. The Bible says his anger burned when he heard his wife's story. And Joseph was arrested, thrown into prison, locked away without a trial, without a hearing, without any chance to defend himself. Just like that, everything he'd built over years of faithful service, gone in a moment. The trust he'd earned, evaporated. The position he'd held, stripped away. And worse than all of that, the injustice of it. He did the right thing, and this was his reward. He honored God, and this was the consequence. He protected his integrity, and it cost him everything. If you've ever been punished for doing right, if you've ever suffered consequences for making the moral choice, if you've ever looked at your obedience and wondered why it led to this, then you understand the bitter confusion Joseph must have felt. The prison was dark, not metaphorically, literally. Egyptian prisons weren't rehabilitation centers. They were dungeons. Narrow cells carved into stone, damp and cold at night, suffocating during the day. No light except what filtered through cracks. No comfort, no softness. Just stone and darkness, and the sound of other prisoners suffering nearby. Joseph must have sat on that cold floor in those first hours, those first days, and tried to make sense of it. He'd already been betrayed by his brothers, already been sold into slavery, already been torn from everything he knew and loved. And now this. Now prison for a crime he didn't commit. Punished for the very righteousness he'd tried so hard to maintain. Where was God? That's the question that must have echoed in his mind, like the sound of his own breathing in that dark cell. Where was God when the lie was told? Where was God when Potiphar believed his wife instead of investigating? Where was God when the prison doors closed and Joseph was left alone in the darkness? It's the same question you ask, isn't it? When you've been faithful and it costs you, when you've done everything right and everything still goes wrong, when you've trusted and obeyed and sacrificed and somehow ended up worse off than if you'd just compromised. Where is God? Why doesn't He intervene? Why doesn't He defend you? Why doesn't He make the truth known and the lies collapse and the justice come swift and clear? But here's what we need to understand. Here's what Joseph couldn't see yet, but we can see from our vantage point in the story. God was there, in the prison, in the darkness, in the injustice and the silence and the waiting. The Lord was with Joseph. The same phrase repeated again, not because Joseph felt it, not because it was obvious, not because circumstances looked blessed, but because it was true regardless of circumstances. God doesn't leave when things get hard. He doesn't abandon you when you're falsely accused. He doesn't step back when the darkness closes in. He's there, even when you can't sense Him, even when the evidence seems to contradict His presence, even when everything looks like absence and feels like abandonment. And slowly, so slowly, Joseph began to see it again, the favor of God, the presence that couldn't be imprisoned, the blessing that followed him even into the pit. The warden noticed him, just like Potiphar had noticed him. There was something different about this prisoner, something trustworthy, something that made him stand out even in a place designed to break men down. So the warden put Joseph in charge of the other prisoners, gave him responsibilities, trusted him with the administration of the prison itself. Another unexpected promotion, another position of authority in a place where he had no business having any. But that's how God works. He lifts you up in the places that are meant to bury you. He gives you favor in the very situations designed to destroy you. It's a strange kind of blessing, isn't it? Success in prison is still prison. Authority over other prisoners is still captivity. The fact that the warden trusted Joseph didn't make him free, didn't undo the injustice, didn't erase the false accusation or restore his name or get him out from behind those walls. He was still there, still locked up, still suffering the consequences of someone else's lie. But here's what I want you to see. Here's what's so crucial for your own dark seasons. God's purpose doesn't stop just because circumstances are unjust. His plan doesn't get derailed just because people lie. His presence doesn't diminish just because you're in a place you never should have been in the first place. Joseph couldn't know it yet, but the prison wasn't the end. It was preparation. Everything that had happened to him, the pit, the slavery, the false accusation, the prison, all of it was forging something in him that couldn't be forged any other way. Character that could withstand pressure, faith that could survive disappointment, integrity that didn't depend on fair treatment or recognition or reward. He was being prepared for something huge, something that would require him to have been tested in every possible way, something that would demand he be trustworthy with power precisely because he'd been faithful without it. But he didn't know that. All he knew was the cold stone beneath him, the darkness around him, the injustice of his situation, and the quiet, persistent presence of God that wouldn't leave even when everything else had been stripped away. Have you been there? Are you there now, in a place where you did everything right and still ended up wrong? Where your integrity cost you instead of protecting you? Where the truth didn't set you free but seemed to bind you tighter? Let me tell you what Joseph learned, what the prison taught him, what the darkness revealed. God is not in the business of immediate vindication. He doesn't always rush in to clear your name or fix the injustice or restore what was taken. Sometimes he lets you sit in the unfairness longer than seems reasonable, longer than seems loving, longer than seems right. But he's doing something. Always, he's doing something. In the waiting, he's working. In the silence, he's speaking. In the darkness, he's shaping. And the very thing that looks like abandonment is actually his deepest act of preparation. Because when your vindication finally comes, and it will come, it will be so complete, so public, so undeniable that everyone who doubted you will see it. Everyone who lied about you will know it. Everyone who counted you out will witness it. But first, you have to be someone who can handle vindication without becoming proud, who can handle power without abusing it, who can handle success without forgetting where you came from and who brought you through. So Joseph waited. In the prison, in the darkness, in the place where innocent men suffered alongside guilty ones, and no one could tell the difference. He waited and he worked, and he trusted that God saw even when no one else did. He trusted that his integrity mattered even when it seemed like it didn't. He trusted that the story wasn't over even though he couldn't see the next chapter. And that trust, that stubborn, quiet, persistent trust in the darkness, was the greatest act of faithfulness he'd performed yet. Not the grand refusal of temptation, not the dramatic running from sin, but the daily choice to believe God was good when everything suggested otherwise. That's faith, real faith, the kind that doesn't depend on seeing or understanding or having proof. The kind that says, I believe you're with me, even in the pit, even in the prison, even in the place where all evidence points to your absence. Tonight, as you lay here in your own darkness, whatever that darkness is, I want you to know that you're not alone. The injustice you've faced doesn't mean God isn't watching. The false accusations don't mean he doesn't know the truth. The waiting doesn't mean he's forgotten. He's there, in the cell with you, in the pit with you, in the hard place you didn't deserve and didn't choose. And he's working something that will make sense one day, something that will be worth it one day, something that will vindicate not just you, but his own character and faithfulness. You don't have to see it yet. You don't have to understand it. You just have to rest in the truth that he's there, that he's faithful, that he hasn't abandoned you no matter what the circumstances scream. Let your body relax now. Let the tension go. Let the anger and confusion and hurt settle for a moment. You don't have to solve it tonight. You don't have to figure out why or how or when. You just have to breathe. Just have to be. Just have to trust that the God who was with Joseph in his prison is with you in yours. And one day, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not even soon, but one day, you'll look back and see that the prison wasn't wasted, that the waiting wasn't empty, that even the injustice served a purpose you couldn't see at the time. Until then, rest, knowing you're held, knowing you're seen, knowing you're not forgotten even when everything feels like forgetfulness. The darkness is deep tonight, but God is deeper. The injustice is real, but God is more real. The pain is heavy, but God is strong enough to carry it with you. You are not alone. You are not abandoned. You are in the middle of a story that isn't finished yet, and the author knows exactly what he's doing, even when you can't read the pages ahead. Sleep now. Rest now. Let go now. The prison doors will open when it's time. The vindication will come when it's right. Until then, you're held by hands that won't let go, by a love that won't fail, by a purpose that won't be stopped by any lie, any betrayal, any injustice. You are safe. You are seen. You are being prepared for something beautiful that's worth every dark night you're walking through. Amen. The stone walls were cold, always cold, no matter how hot the Egyptian sun burned outside. Joseph could feel the dampness seeping through his clothes, settling into his bones, a constant reminder that this was his world now. 4 walls, iron bars, darkness that pressed in like a living thing. This was supposed to break him. Prisons are designed to break people, to strip away dignity, hope, identity, until all that's left is a shell. But something strange was happening in this prison. Something the guards couldn't explain. Something even Joseph himself probably didn't fully understand at first. The Lord was with him, even here, even in this place where innocent men rotted alongside guilty ones, where justice was a distant memory, where hope came to die. God was there. The warden noticed it first. There was something different about this Hebrew prisoner. Something in the way he carried himself. Something in the way he spoke to the other inmates. Something that made you want to trust him, even though trusting anyone in prison was usually a mistake. Maybe it was the way Joseph worked. Not with the defeated shuffle of a man who'd given up, but with quiet dignity, with purpose, as if even here, even now, what he did still mattered. Or maybe it was something deeper, something the warden couldn't name but could sense. A presence that followed Joseph like a shadow, like light, like an invisible hand that guided everything he touched. Whatever it was, the warden found himself doing something unusual. He put Joseph in charge, not of a small task, not of a few prisoners, but of the entire prison. A slave who'd been falsely accused, a foreigner with no rights, a man who should have had no power at all, suddenly held the keys to other men's lives. And under Joseph's management, everything ran smoothly. Disputes were settled fairly. Work was organized efficiently. Even the guards noticed that their jobs became easier when Joseph was handling things. It was the same pattern that had emerged in Potiphar's house. The same mysterious blessing, the same inexplicable success. Except now it was happening in chains. Now it was happening behind bars. Now it was happening in a place that was meant to be the end of the road. And somehow Joseph was turning it into something else. Not freedom. He was still a prisoner. Let's not romanticize that. The injustice was still real. The bars were still locked. The nights were still long and cold and filled with the sounds of men who'd lost everything. But within those constraints, within that suffering, God was working. God was present. God was using even this. You know, there's something profound about finding God in a prison. When everything external is stripped away, when you have nothing to offer, when there's no reason for blessing except God's own choice to bless, that's when you discover if your faith is real. Joseph could have been bitter. He had every right to be. He could have looked at the warden's trust and thought, too little, too late. He could have gone through the motions without his heart in it. He could have let the injustice poison everything he touched. But he didn't. He did the work in front of him, with excellence, with integrity, with the same faithfulness he'd shown in Potiphar's house. Not because circumstances were fair, they weren't. Not because he was being rewarded, he wasn't. But because that's who he was. That's who God had made him. And no prison could change that. No false accusation could erase it. No amount of suffering could strip it away. If you're in your own kind of prison tonight, and maybe you are, maybe you're locked in by circumstances you didn't choose, by consequences that aren't fair, by walls you can't climb and doors you can't open. Let me tell you what Joseph discovered. God doesn't need you to be free to use you. He doesn't need your circumstances to be perfect before he can work. He doesn't need justice to be served before he can bless. He can meet you in the cell. He can give you purpose in the prison. He can put his hand on your life even when your hands are bound. The question isn't whether he's powerful enough to break you out. Of course he is. The question is whether you'll trust him enough to serve him faithfully right where you are, even if the walls never come down, even if the door never opens, even if this is your reality for longer than you think you can bear. Joseph served in that prison, and the Bible doesn't tell us he complained. Doesn't tell us he raged against God or lost his faith or became someone unrecognizable. It just says, quietly, almost as an afterthought, the Lord was with Joseph. That's it. That's the whole explanation. That's the secret to how a man survives years of injustice without becoming bitter. The Lord was with him, not fixing everything immediately, not erasing the pain, not explaining the why, just being there, being present, being faithful when nothing else was. And sometimes that's enough. Not always, but sometimes. Sometimes just knowing you're not alone in the darkness is what gives you strength to take the next breath, to face the next day, to keep your integrity intact when giving up would be so much easier. The prison was quiet at night. You could hear everything, every groan from another cell, every shift of a body on stone, every whispered prayer or curse. And in that quiet, Joseph must have thought about his dreams. Those dreams from so long ago, when he was 17 and naive and wearing a coat of many colors. Dreams of his brothers bowing down, of sheaves and stars and a future that looked nothing like this present. Were they still true? Could they still come to pass, or had they died in the pit where his brothers threw him? Died in the slave markets of Egypt? Died in this prison cell where hope went to be buried? He didn't know. He couldn't know. All he could do was trust that the God who gave the dreams was the same God who was with him now. And if that was true, then somehow, impossibly, the story wasn't over yet. Let your breathing slow now. Feel the rise and fall of your chest. Notice how your body knows how to rest even when your mind doesn't. You're carrying something heavy. I can feel it. We all can. Maybe it's injustice. Maybe it's disappointment. Maybe it's just the grinding exhaustion of circumstances that won't change no matter how hard you work or how faithful you are. And you're wondering, like Joseph wondered, if God really sees, if he really cares, if any of this matters. Let me whisper this to you as gently as I can. He sees. He's there, even in your prison, even in your darkness, even in the place where you feel most abandoned. The Lord is with you, not because you've earned it, not because you're doing everything perfectly, but because that's who he is. He doesn't leave, he doesn't forget, he doesn't abandon his children in the hard places. So rest tonight, knowing that even in the cell, even behind the bars, even in the waiting that feels endless, you are not alone. You are held. You are seen. And purpose is being worked out in ways you can't trace yet, but will one day look back on and understand. Time in prison does strange things to your sense of reality. Days blur together. Weeks become indistinguishable. And you start to wonder if life outside these walls was real or just a dream you once had. But then something happens, something small, something that reminds you that there's still a world out there, still events unfolding, still a story being written that's bigger than your cell. For Joseph, that something came in the form of 2 new prisoners. They weren't ordinary criminals. They were Pharaoh's officials, important men, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, men who had access to the king himself, who served in the palace, who had power and prestige until something went wrong, and they ended up here in this same prison where Joseph had been languishing for years now. The warden put them under Joseph's care. Another responsibility, another task, another opportunity to serve people who probably wouldn't remember his name once they were gone. But Joseph did it anyway, because that's what faithfulness looks like, taking care of the next person in front of you, even when you have no idea if it will matter. One morning, Joseph came to check on them and noticed something different. Their faces, the way they held themselves. There was a heaviness about them that wasn't there before. Not the usual prison despair. Something else. Something specific. "Why do you look so sad today?" he asked. Such a simple question, such a human moment. One prisoner noticing the suffering of others and caring enough to ask. That alone tells you something about Joseph, about what prison hadn't managed to steal from him. His compassion, his ability to see beyond his own pain, his willingness to be present for others even when his own life was falling apart. "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there's no one to interpret them." And just like that, something shifted in the air. Dreams. Joseph knew about dreams. He'd had his own once. Dreams that had cost him everything. Dreams that had brought him to this very prison. Dreams that he'd almost stopped believing in. But when these men mentioned dreams, something stirred in him. Not hope exactly, not yet, but a recognition, a sense that maybe, just maybe, God was moving again. "Do not interpretations belong to God?" Joseph said. "Tell me your dreams." Notice what he didn't say. He didn't claim to be a dream interpreter. He didn't boast about his abilities. He pointed to God. Even here, even after everything. His first instinct was to acknowledge that any insight, any understanding, any ability to see beyond the surface came from God, not himself. The cupbearer went first. He described his dream: 3 branches on a vine, budding and blossoming and ripening into grapes. And then Pharaoh's cup in his hand, and he squeezed the grapes into it and gave it to Pharaoh. As he spoke, Joseph listened, not just with his ears, but with something deeper, with the part of him that had learned to recognize God's voice even in the silence. And the interpretation came, clear as daylight, undeniable. "This is what it means," Joseph said. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer." Good news. A happy ending. Freedom just 3 days away. And then Joseph did something vulnerable, something risky, something that showed just how much he still dared to hope despite everything. He asked for help. "But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." There it is, the raw truth, the cry of a man who's been faithful for so long with so little to show for it. The plea of someone who's done everything right and still ended up in chains. He wasn't demanding. He wasn't entitled. He was just asking, hoping, putting himself out there one more time even though he'd been disappointed so many times before. The baker, hearing the cupbearer's good news, felt hope rise in his chest. Maybe his dream meant something good too. He told Joseph what he'd seen: 3 baskets of bread on his head and birds eating from the top basket. But this time, when Joseph listened, when he waited for the interpretation, it came differently, darker, final. This is what it means. Joseph said, and you can hear the weight in his voice. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh. Death, not restoration, not freedom, just death. Can you imagine having to deliver that message? Having to look someone in the eye and tell them their end is coming? Joseph didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't soften it. He told the truth, even when the truth was terrible, because that's what integrity requires. Not just faithfulness when it's convenient, but honesty even when it costs something. 3 days passed, just like Joseph said they would. Pharaoh had a birthday celebration, and he remembered his imprisoned officials. The cupbearer was restored to his position, exactly as the dream had foretold. Back to the palace, back to his life, back to serving Pharaoh's wine. The baker was executed, exactly as Joseph had warned. His body hung as a grim reminder of Pharaoh's power and displeasure. 2 dreams, 2 interpretations. Both came true precisely as Joseph had spoken them. You'd think that would matter. You'd think that would mean something. You'd think the cupbearer, grateful for his life and freedom, would rush to mention Joseph to Pharaoh, would advocate for the man who had interpreted his dream, would show the kindness Joseph had asked for. But he didn't. The Bible says it plainly, heartbreakingly. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Forgot him. Just like that. Back to his comfortable life, back to his important position, back to the palace where prisoners were easy to forget and promises made in desperation were even easier to break. And Joseph. Joseph stayed in prison. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. 2 full years, the Bible tells us. 2 years of waiting, of wondering, of hoping that maybe today would be the day someone remembered, someone cared, someone came to get him out. Have you ever been forgotten? Have you ever helped someone, gone out of your way for them, maybe even saved them in some way, and then watched them walk back into their life without a backward glance? Have you ever felt the sting of being invisible, disposable, easy to overlook once you're no longer useful? That's where Joseph was, still in prison, still faithful, still doing his job, managing the other prisoners, still trusting God even though every external sign pointed to abandonment. The dreams he'd interpreted had come true, which should have proven his gift, should have opened doors, should have changed something. But nothing changed. He was still there, still waiting, still hoping, still believing that somehow, impossibly, God hadn't forgotten, even if everyone else had. Tonight, if you're waiting for someone to remember you, if you're hoping for a promise to be kept that seems to have been forgotten, if you're wondering how long you're supposed to keep being faithful when faithfulness seems to lead nowhere, let me tell you what this part of the story teaches us. God's timing is not our timing. The cupbearer forgot Joseph, but God didn't. The years passed slowly, painfully, but they weren't wasted. Every day in that prison was shaping Joseph into someone who could handle what was coming, who could be trusted with power because he'd been faithful without it, who could stay humble in success because he'd survived the depths of failure. You can't rush that kind of formation. You can't shortcut that kind of character development. It has to be lived, slowly, one disappointing day at a time. The dreams still mattered. The interpretations still proved Joseph's gift. The cupbearer's forgetfulness didn't change any of that. It just meant the timing wasn't right yet. And sometimes, most times actually, God's best gifts come wrapped in waiting, come through delays that feel like denials, come after we've given up hope and learned to trust Him without the promise of reward. Joseph was being prepared for something massive, something that would require him to be someone specific, and that person could only be forged in fire, shaped in silence, refined in the long, lonely years when no one was watching and no one seemed to care. So rest now. Let your breathing steady. Let the disappointment settle without becoming bitterness. The waiting isn't punishment. The silence isn't abandonment. The delay isn't denial. It's preparation. It's refinement. It's God working in the invisible places, building something in you that will be needed for what He's building ahead of you. 2 years. Let that sink in for a moment. 2 years. 730 days. 17,520 hours. Each one passing slowly in that prison cell. 2 years of waking up and wondering if today would be the day. 2 years of hope deferred, of disappointment compounding, of slowly learning to lower your expectations so they can't hurt you as much when they're crushed again. Joseph must have replayed that conversation with the cupbearer 1,000 times in his mind. Remember me. Mention me to Pharaoh. Get me out of this prison. Had he said it right? Should he have been more forceful, less desperate? Maybe the cupbearer didn't forget. Maybe he just didn't care enough to help. Maybe Joseph had misread the situation, overestimated his importance, dared to hope for something that was never going to happen. The silence was the hardest part. Not knowing if he'd been forgotten or ignored, if the cupbearer had tried and failed, or simply never tried at all. Just silence. The days kept coming indifferent to Joseph's pain. The sun rose and set visible only as changing light through the prison windows. The guards changed shifts. Prisoners came and went. Life moved on everywhere except in Joseph's cell, where time seemed to stand still, frozen in an endless loop of waiting that led nowhere. And slowly, so slowly you might not even notice it happening, hope begins to change shape, not disappear entirely. Joseph never completely lost hope, but it transforms into something quieter, something less expectant, something that's learned to survive on very little oxygen. This is what extended waiting does to us. It's not the initial disappointment that breaks you. That's sharp and painful, but you can survive it. It's the long, slow grinding of days that all look the same. The relentless monotony of nothing changing. The exhaustion of keeping hope alive when there's no evidence it's reasonable to hope. You start to wonder if you imagined the promise. Start to question if you heard God right. Start to think maybe you were naive to believe things would ever be different. And in those moments, in those long dark stretches where nothing happens and no one comes, faith becomes something different than you thought it was. It becomes less about feeling confident and more about simply not quitting. Less about seeing the path forward and more about taking the next step anyway. Less about understanding God's plan and more about trusting His character even when His plan makes no sense. Joseph kept working. That's what kills me about this part of the story. He kept working. He didn't stop managing the prison just because he was disappointed. He didn't become bitter and cruel to the other prisoners just because he was suffering. He didn't use his small amount of power to make life harder for others the way life had been made hard for him. He just kept showing up, kept doing the work in front of him, kept being faithful, even though faithfulness had brought him nothing but more prison time. That's not the kind of faith that gets celebrated. That's not the dramatic, mountain-moving faith that makes for good testimony. That's the quiet, stubborn, one foot in front of the other faith that most of us actually need. The faith that doesn't require signs or wonders, just requires not giving up when there's every reason to give up. Do you know what I think God was doing in those 2 years? I think he was making sure Joseph was ready. Not ready in the sense of having the right skills. Joseph probably had those years ago, but ready in the deeper sense. Ready in his soul. Ready in the parts of you that only suffering can reach, and only waiting can refine. Because what was coming for Joseph required a specific kind of person. Someone who could handle absolute power without abusing it. Someone who could forgive the unforgivable. Someone who could see the big picture even when the present moment was painful. Someone who could be trusted to steward resources wisely because he'd learned to be faithful with nothing. You can't rush that kind of development. You can't manufacture it in comfortable circumstances. It has to be lived, slowly, painfully, in the crucible of waiting that feels endless. The cupbearer went about his life in the palace, serving wine to Pharaoh, attending to his duties, living in the luxury and comfort of Egyptian royalty. And maybe sometimes, late at night, a flicker of memory crossed his mind. That Hebrew prisoner who'd interpreted his dream. Wonder whatever happened to him. But the thought passed quickly, because comfortable people don't tend to think much about the suffering of others, especially when helping would require effort or risk or uncomfortable conversations. So Joseph remained forgotten. Not by God, God never forgot, but by the people who could have helped him, by the person he'd helped first. And isn't that always the way the ones who could open doors don't, and the ones who would, if they could, can't? But here's the mystery woven through this entire story. Here's what Joseph couldn't see, but we can. God's delays are not God's denials. When the door doesn't open when you think it should, when the rescue doesn't come when you're sure you can't survive another day, when the promise seems dead and buried and forgotten, God is still working. He's working in the timing. He's working in the waiting. He's working in you shaping something that can't be shaped any other way. If the cupbearer had remembered Joseph immediately, if Joseph had been released from prison right away, he would have missed something crucial. He wouldn't have been ready for what God was preparing him for. The timing had to be perfect, not for Joseph's comfort, but for God's purpose. So Joseph waited, in the silence, in the darkness, in the seemingly endless loop of days that all felt the same. He waited and he worked, and he trusted that somehow, even though he couldn't see it, even though every piece of evidence suggested otherwise, God was still there, still faithful, still working, still writing a story that made sense even if Joseph couldn't read it yet. That's faith, the real kind, the kind that doesn't need constant confirmation, the kind that can survive silence, the kind that keeps going even when there's no applause, no breakthrough, no evidence that anything you're doing matters. Joseph had that kind of faith. not because he was special or superhuman or less hurt than you would be, but because he'd learned something profound in the waiting. He'd learned that God's presence wasn't dependent on God's intervention, that being with God was enough even when God didn't seem to be doing anything. And so the days passed, one after another. The prison stayed locked, the silence stretched on, and Joseph remained faithful in the darkness, not knowing that the darkness was almost over, not knowing that his life was about to change so dramatically he wouldn't recognize it, not knowing that every single day he'd waited had been necessary for what was coming next. He just kept breathing, kept trusting, kept hoping in a hope that had learned to be patient, kept believing in a God who seemed silent but wasn't absent. And that stubborn, quiet persistence in the face of overwhelming disappointment, that was the final test, the one that proved he was ready for freedom, ready for power, ready for the purpose he'd been born for, but had to be broken to fulfill. Tonight, wherever you are in your waiting, whatever silence you're sitting in, whatever promise seems forgotten or delayed beyond all reason, let me tell you what Joseph learned. The waiting is not wasted. The silence is not emptiness. The delay is not abandonment. God is working in the invisible places, in the quiet spaces, in the times when nothing seems to be happening. He's working in you, shaping you, preparing you, making you ready for something you can't imagine yet. And when the time is right, when you're ready, when the purpose aligns with the preparation, the door will open, the rescue will come, the promise will be fulfilled. But until then, until that moment arrives, you have to trust. Trust that He sees. Trust that He's faithful. Trust that He hasn't forgotten even when everyone else has. Let your body sink deeper now. Feel the weight of your limbs. Feel the steady rhythm of your breath. Feel how your heart keeps beating even when everything else feels stopped. That's God's faithfulness in physical form. The way He keeps you going even when you don't think you can. The way He sustains you in the waiting. The way He holds you together when everything else is falling apart. You are not forgotten. You are not abandoned. You are in the middle of a story that's still being written, and the author knows exactly what he's doing. The silence is not the end of the conversation. The waiting is not the end of the journey. The darkness is not where you'll stay. This is just the part of the story where faith is tested, where character is forged, where you become someone who can handle the blessing when it finally arrives. So, rest tonight. Rest in the knowledge that God's timing is perfect, even when it feels terrible. Rest in the promise that He who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. Rest in the truth that your waiting is not in vain. Your tears are not unnoticed. Your faithfulness matters even when no one is applauding. Rest and trust and let go. Because you don't have to hold on so tightly when you know you're being held by hands that never let go, by a love that never forgets, by a purpose that cannot be stopped by any delay, any disappointment, any human forgetfulness. You are held. You are known. You are being prepared. And when the time is right, when the moment comes, you'll look back on this waiting and see it differently. You'll see it as gift, as preparation, as the very thing that made you ready for what God always knew was coming. Sleep now, beloved. Let the silence be gentle. Let the waiting be a teacher. Let the darkness be the place where God does His deepest work. You are not alone. you have never been alone, and morning is coming, even if it takes longer than you thought. Even if the night is darker than you expected, morning is coming, and with it a future you can't imagine yet, but God has been planning all along. Amen. 2 years had passed since the cupbearer walked out of prison, and in those 2 years, Joseph had learned to stop counting days. He'd learned to stop hoping every time footsteps approached his cell, learned to stop believing that today might be different from yesterday. But then one night, far away in the royal palace, something happened that would change everything. Pharaoh had a dream. Not just any dream, the kind that wakes you up with your heart pounding, the kind that stays with you long after you open your eyes, the kind that feels important even though you don't understand why. He was standing by the Nile River, and 7 cows came up out of the water. Fat cows, healthy cows, sleek and beautiful grazing contentedly in the marsh grass. And then 7 more cows came up behind them, but these were different, thin and ugly and gaunt, so emaciated you could see their ribs, and they ate the fat cows, just consumed them, and somehow, impossibly, they stayed just as thin as before. Pharaoh woke up disturbed, his mind racing, but eventually he fell back asleep. And immediately he dreamed again. This time he saw 7 heads of grain, full and ripe and golden, swaying gently on a single stalk, beautiful, perfect, ready for harvest. Then 7 more heads sprouted, but these were thin and scorched, blighted by the east wind, and they swallowed up the good grain. Again Pharaoh woke, and this time sleep wouldn't come back. He lay there in the darkness of his chamber, surrounded by all the luxury and power that came with being Pharaoh, and yet feeling deeply unsettled. These weren't ordinary dreams. They meant something. He could feel it in his bones, in the way they repeated the same pattern twice, in the way the images stayed so vivid in his mind. 7 of one thing, 7 of another, consumption, scarcity. Something was being communicated, and he needed to understand what. Morning came, and Pharaoh summoned his magicians, his wise men, all the dream interpreters in Egypt. These were men trained in the ancient arts, men who studied symbols and omens, men whose entire profession was understanding the language of dreams. They came with their charts and their theories, their mystical formulas and their confident assertions. But when Pharaoh told them his dreams, something strange happened. They had no answer. None of them could interpret it. They stood there, these supposed experts, and offered nothing but silence or vague platitudes that satisfied no one. It was as if the dreams were locked, sealed with a key that none of their knowledge could turn. And Pharaoh grew more agitated, more frustrated, because he knew. He knew these dreams mattered, and time was slipping away and no one could help him. Then the cupbearer, standing there among all the officials, felt something stir in his memory. A flicker at first, then stronger, until suddenly it came flooding back. The prison, the Hebrew slave, the dream he'd had 2 years ago, and the interpretation that had come true exactly as predicted. Today I am reminded of my shortcomings, he said, and you can hear the guilt in those words, the admission that he'd forgotten, that he'd failed to keep a promise. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now, a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. Pharaoh listened, and something shifted in the room. Send for him immediately. Bring this Hebrew, this prisoner, this man who apparently had the gift that all the magicians lacked. And just like that, after years of waiting, after 2 years of silence since the cupbearer left, after decades of suffering and betrayal and imprisonment, Joseph's moment arrived. Not because he manipulated it, not because he finally gave up hoping, but because God's timing, which had seemed so slow, so painful, so incomprehensible, was actually perfect. The dream interpreters had to fail first. Pharaoh had to be desperate. The cupbearer had to remember at exactly the right moment. Every piece had to be in place. And now, finally, it was time. The guards came to Joseph's cell, and their urgency was different this time. Pharaoh has sent for you. Quickly, you must prepare. Joseph must have stood there for a moment, trying to process, trying to understand if this was real or just another cruel twist in a life full of them. But there was no time to think. They took him to wash, to shave, to change out of his prison clothes into something presentable. Can you imagine? One moment you're in the darkness you've known for years, the filth, the familiar stone walls, and the next moment water is being poured over you. Clean clothes are being placed in your hands, and you're being told you're about to stand before the most powerful man in the world. The transformation was so fast, so complete, that Joseph's head must have been spinning, his hands shaking as he washed away the grime, his heart pounding as he tried to steady himself. But here's what's beautiful. Here's what tells you everything about who Joseph had become in those years of suffering. He didn't panic. He didn't scramble to prepare a speech or rehearse what he'd say or worry about making a good impression. He just got ready, calmly, quietly, with the same dignity he'd carried through every other impossible situation. Because he'd learned something profound in the waiting. He'd learned that his life wasn't in his own hands, that outcomes weren't his to control, that all he could do was be faithful and leave the results to God. So he washed, he dressed, he took a breath, and then he walked, one step at a time, out of the prison that had held him for so long, through corridors he'd never seen, toward a future he couldn't imagine. The palace was overwhelming. Gold everywhere, intricate carvings, walls painted with scenes of Egyptian glory, guards in ceremonial dress, officials in fine linen. The wealth, the beauty, the sheer scale of it must have been disorienting after years in a cell. But Joseph kept walking, through the great halls, past the curious stares of people who saw only a Hebrew slave, who had no idea they were looking at the man who would soon rule over them all. And then, finally, he was brought into Pharaoh's presence, the throne room, the seat of absolute power. Pharaoh himself, surrounded by his court, looking troubled despite all his authority. And Joseph stood there, this man who'd been a slave and a prisoner, who'd been forgotten and abandoned and betrayed, standing before the king of Egypt as if he belonged there. Pharaoh spoke. "I had a dream and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And here, right here, is the moment that reveals everything. Joseph could have seized this opportunity, could have played up his abilities, could have made himself sound impressive or mysterious or indispensable. But instead, listen to what he said. I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. I cannot do it. 3 words that acknowledged his limitations. 3 words that pointed away from himself. 3 words that gave all credit to God before anyone even knew if he could help. That's humility. That's the kind of character that gets forged in suffering. That's what happens when you've been brought so low that you have nothing left to prove and no ego left to protect. So Pharaoh told him the dreams, the 7 fat cows and the 7 thin cows, the 7 good heads of grain and the 7 scorched ones. And as Joseph listened, something happened that he'd experienced before, but never quite like this. The interpretation came, clear and complete, not from his own wisdom, but from somewhere beyond himself. God was speaking through him, using him, giving him words that would change the course of nations. The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. Joseph said, his voice steady, his mind clear. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. He explained it all. 7 years of abundance coming to Egypt. Harvests so plentiful that the land would overflow with grain. But then 7 years of famine, so severe that all the abundance would be forgotten, so devastating that it would consume everything. And God had shown this to Pharaoh twice because the matter was fixed, certain, imminent. It was going to happen. The only question was whether Egypt would be ready. And then Joseph did something remarkable. He didn't stop with the interpretation. He gave Pharaoh a plan. Find a wise and discerning man. Put him in charge of the land. Appoint commissioners to take 1/5 of the harvest during the 7 good years. Store it up. Preserve it, so that when the famine comes, when the thin cows devour the fat ones, when the scorched grain swallows the healthy stalks, Egypt will survive. The throne room was silent when he finished. Everyone was looking at Pharaoh, waiting to see how he'd respond. And Pharaoh, this powerful king who'd been troubled all morning, who'd summoned every expert in his kingdom and found no answers, looked at Joseph with something like wonder. Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? He asked his officials. And then he turned back to Joseph. Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. It happened so fast. One moment, Joseph was interpreting a dream. The next moment, Pharaoh was taking off his signet ring, the ring that bore the seal of all Egypt's authority, and putting it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen, placed a gold chain around his neck, had him ride in a chariot as second in command. I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt, Pharaoh declared. And just like that, in less time than it takes to tell it, Joseph went from prisoner to prime minister, from forgotten to powerful, from the lowest place to the highest position anyone could hold except Pharaoh himself. The very morning had started in a prison cell, and it was ending in a palace, with authority over an entire nation resting on his shoulders. Do you see it? Do you see what God was doing all along the pit where his brothers threw him? It taught him to survive in low places. The years as a slave in Potiphar's house, they taught him to manage a household with excellence. The false accusation and imprisonment, they taught him about injustice and mercy, and staying faithful when circumstances were unfair. The 2 years of extra waiting after the cupbearer forgot him, they taught him patience and broke any last shred of self-reliance. Every single thing that had happened to him, every betrayal, every disappointment, every moment of suffering, had been preparing him for this, for a position that would require him to manage the resources of a nation, for a role that would demand wisdom and integrity, and the ability to plan for a future no one else could see. For a moment when he would literally hold the power of life and death for millions of people. And here's the beautiful paradox. Here's what makes this story so profound. Joseph had to go down before he could go up. He had to be broken before he could be trusted with power. He had to lose everything before he could be given everything. Because power corrupts. We all know that. Power reveals who you really are and magnifies both your strengths and your weaknesses. But Joseph had been tested in ways that proved his character was solid all the way through. He'd had authority as a slave and didn't abuse it. He'd been faithful in prison where no one was watching. He'd stayed pure when he could have compromised. He'd given God credit when he could have taken it for himself. He was ready. In a way he never could have been if life had been easy, in a way that only suffering can produce. The 7 years of abundance began, just as Joseph had predicted. The harvests were extraordinary, grain pouring in like sand on the seashore, so much that they stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. And Joseph oversaw it all, the building of storehouses, the collection of the surplus, the systematic preparation for the famine he knew was coming. No one else believed it would happen. How could they? Everything was so abundant, so prosperous, so good. It must have seemed paranoid, excessive, this obsession with storing grain when there was more than enough for everyone. But Joseph knew. He'd learned to trust what God showed him even when it contradicted what his eyes could see. So he prepared, methodically, faithfully, storing up resources that would one day save not just Egypt, but his own family, the very brothers who had betrayed him. Then the 7 years of famine began. The Nile didn't flood, the crops failed, the grain ran out, and slowly, then quickly, hunger spread across the known world. Egypt, Canaan, all the surrounding lands. People were starving, desperate. And suddenly, those storehouses Joseph had filled. Suddenly, that grain he'd insisted on collecting. Suddenly, his planning that had seemed excessive became the only thing standing between millions of people and death. And when the famine hit, when the people cried out to Pharaoh for food, Pharaoh sent them to Joseph. Go to Joseph and do what he tells you. The prisoner had become the provider. The forgotten one had become essential. The man thrown away by his family was now the one everyone had to come to for survival. Let your breathing slow now. Feel how your chest rises and falls. Notice how, even in the telling of this story, something in you recognizes the pattern. The way down that leads to the way up. The breaking that precedes the building. The darkness that comes before the dawn. Joseph's life is your life, or it can be, if you'll trust the process even when it makes no sense. If you'll stay faithful in the prison. If you'll keep your integrity when it costs you. If you'll give God credit when success finally comes. Because here's what this story teaches us. Here's what Joseph's journey reveals. Every pit has a purpose. Every prison has a door. Every season of waiting is preparing you for something you can't see yet, but God has planned all along. You might be in your prison tonight. You might be in that season of waiting that feels endless. You might be wondering if God has forgotten, if your faithfulness matters, if there's any point to holding on. But let me whisper this to you as gently as I can. Your morning is coming. Your moment is being prepared. Your promotion is in God's hands and His timing is perfect, even when it feels impossibly slow. Don't give up in the prison. Don't lose hope in the waiting. Don't let bitterness poison the character that God is building in you. Because when your time comes, and it will come, you need to be ready. You need to be someone who can handle blessing without being destroyed by it. Someone who can have power without abusing it. Someone who remembers where you came from and gives God glory for where you're going. Joseph stood in Pharaoh's court, wearing royal robes, carrying the signet ring, riding in a chariot while people bowed before him. And he could have been tempted to pride, could have thought he'd earned this through his own merit, could have forgotten the God who'd been with him through every dark moment, but he didn't, because the pit had taught him humility, the prison had taught him dependence, the waiting had taught him that God's timing is always right even when it's painful. So, he served Egypt with the same faithfulness he'd shown in Potiphar's house, with the same integrity he'd maintained in prison, with the same trust in God that had sustained him through everything. And the dreams, those dreams from so long ago, those visions of his brothers bowing down that had seemed so impossible, they were about to come true. Not the way he'd imagined when he was 17 and wearing his coat of many colors. Not through force or manipulation or revenge, but through a plan so intricate, so perfect, so thoroughly God orchestrated that when it finally unfolded there would be no doubt who was behind it. Joseph had been sent ahead, placed in position, given authority and resources, not for his own sake, though he was blessed, but for the sake of others, for the salvation of his family, for the preservation of the very people who had tried to destroy him. That's the ultimate paradox of Joseph's story. His suffering saved his betrayers. His elevation preserved his enemies. The pit they threw him in became the pathway to their survival. And Joseph, who'd been so hurt, so betrayed, so abandoned, would be the one to offer them grace. But we're not there yet. We're still in this moment of transformation, still marveling at the speed with which God can change everything when His time arrives, still learning to trust that the delays aren't denials, that the closed doors are leading to open ones, that the things that look like endings are actually just beginnings we can't recognize yet. So rest tonight in this truth. Your story isn't over. Your purpose isn't void. Your pain hasn't been wasted. Like Joseph, you're being prepared, shaped, refined, made ready for something bigger than you can imagine. And when your moment comes, when the door opens, when the call arrives, you'll be ready. Not because you're perfect, not because you never doubted or struggled or questioned, but because you stayed faithful anyway, because you kept your integrity anyway, because you trusted God anyway. And that faithfulness, that stubborn, quiet persistence through the darkness, that's what qualifies you for the light. That's what prepares you for promotion. That's what transforms suffering into purpose and pain into power and prisoners into princes. Sleep now, beloved. Let your body rest. Let your mind be still. Let your heart trust that the God who was with Joseph is with you. The same God who brought him out of the pit will bring you out of yours. The same God who elevated him from prison will elevate you from whatever place you're stuck. The same God who fulfilled those dreams will fulfill his promises to you. It might take longer than you want. It might hurt more than you expected. It might look different than you imagined. But it will come. Your breakthrough will come. Your vindication will come. Your purpose will be revealed. And when it does, when you're standing in your own palace moment, when you're looking back on all the pain and seeing how it all fit together, you'll understand. You'll see the purpose in the pit, the reason for the prison, the wisdom in the waiting. Until then, rest in the arms of a God who never forgot you, who never abandoned you, who was with you in every dark moment and is still with you now. You are loved, you are held, you are being prepared, and your morning is coming. Amen. The famine had spread everywhere, like a slow, creeping death that consumed first the crops, then the livestock, then the hope in people's eyes. In Canaan, Jacob looked at his sons and said what they'd all been thinking. "I have heard there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die." So 10 of Joseph's brothers prepared for the journey, all of them except Benjamin the youngest, the one Jacob kept close because he couldn't bear to lose another child. They had no idea. How could they? That the grain they were seeking had been stored up by the brother they'd betrayed. That God was orchestrating a reunion that would shatter them and heal them and transform everything. When they arrived in Egypt, when they finally stood before the official in charge of selling grain, they bowed down with their faces to the ground. And Joseph saw. Joseph recognized them immediately. These men who'd aged but were still unmistakably his brothers. And in that instant, everything came rushing back. The coat torn from his body, the pit, the terror, the betrayal. And then he saw them bowing, and he remembered his dreams, those dreams from so long ago that had cost him everything. It was happening, exactly as God had shown him when he was 17 years old. But they didn't recognize him. The last time they saw Joseph, he was a teenager wearing that coat of many colors. Now he was a man in Egyptian royal garments, speaking through an interpreter, wielding absolute power. The transformation was so complete that they looked right at him and saw only an Egyptian official. Something in Joseph made him decide not to reveal himself. Not yet. He needed to know who these men were now. Had they changed? So he spoke to them harshly, accused them of being spies, and they defended themselves, explaining they were brothers, 12 of them originally, though one was no longer with them, and the youngest had stayed home with their father. Joseph's heart clenched when they mentioned Benjamin. He was alive. So Joseph made them an impossible demand. Go back. Bring your youngest brother. Leave one of you here as a guarantee. And the brothers looked at each other with fear and said something they didn't know Joseph could understand. Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. Joseph had to turn away, had to leave the room before they saw his tears. They did remember. They did regret. They'd been living with the guilt all these years. Joseph wept, but not where they could see. And then he composed himself and returned. He kept Simeon, filled their bags with grain, and secretly returned their silver. The brothers returned to Canaan, but the famine continued, and eventually they had no choice. They had to go back. They had to take Benjamin. And when Joseph saw his younger brother, when he saw the face that reminded him of their mother, emotion overwhelmed him. He had to rush to his private room and weep. But the final test was still to come. Joseph had his steward put his silver cup in Benjamin's sack, and then accused Benjamin of theft. When the punishment was announced that Benjamin would become a slave and the rest could go free, Judah stepped forward. Judah, whose plan it had been to sell Joseph. Judah, who now said, "Please let your servant remain here as my lord's slave in place of the boy. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me?" He was willing to give up his freedom to protect Benjamin. They'd changed. These brothers who'd been so cruel had been transformed, and Joseph couldn't hold back anymore. "Have everyone leave my presence," Joseph said suddenly, his voice breaking, and the Egyptian officials left until only Joseph and his brothers remained. Then Joseph began to weep. Not quiet tears, not dignified tears, but loud, anguished, soul-deep weeping, the kind that comes from a place so buried you didn't know it was still there. The Egyptians in the next rooms could hear him, and through his tears, through sobs that shook his whole body, Joseph managed to speak. "I am Joseph." 3 words, just 3 words, but they changed everything. The brothers froze, unable to process. This Egyptian official was Joseph, their Joseph. The brother they'd betrayed, terror must have paralyzed them. They knew what they deserved. Joseph had every right to destroy them. This was the moment of reckoning. But that's not what happened. Instead, Joseph said something that would echo through history. "Do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." Wait, let that sink in. Do not be angry with yourselves. After everything they'd done, Joseph's first words weren't accusation. They were comfort. They were release. How do you get to a place where you can look at the people who destroyed your life and tell them not to be angry with themselves? You get there through years of wrestling with God, through nights in prison when you have to choose between bitterness and trust. Joseph had time to think, years to think, and somewhere in that darkness he'd come to see it differently. Not that his brothers weren't guilty, they were, but that God had taken their evil and used it for good. "It was not you who sent me here, but God," Joseph continued. "He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler of all Egypt." Do you hear what he's saying? Their worst intentions were met by God's best purposes. That's the mystery of providence. God doesn't cause evil, but he redeems it. The brothers were speechless, terrified, and Joseph saw their fear, saw them trembling. So he spoke again, more gently, "Come close to me." And they did, slowly, hesitantly. And Joseph looked at them with tears still streaming and said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. But now do not be grieved, for God has sent me before you to preserve life." He said it again, made sure they heard it, because forgiveness has to be spoken more than once. And then he did something even more remarkable. He kissed them. He embraced them. He held them close, these brothers who'd hurt him so badly, and he wept on them, drawing them in, breaking down the walls that 2 decades had built. Forgiveness is one of the hardest and most divine things humans can do. It goes against everything that screams for justice. Forgiveness says, "You hurt me deeply, and I'm choosing to release you anyway." It doesn't mean the pain wasn't real. It means you're refusing to let the offense define the rest of your story. Joseph could have destroyed his brothers, but instead he forgave. And in forgiving, he freed not just them, but himself. Because unforgiveness is a prison. You think you're punishing the person who hurt you by holding on to anger, but really, you're punishing yourself. Forgiveness doesn't excuse the offense. It just says, "I'm not going to let this destroy me anymore." Let your breathing deepen now. Feel how your chest expands and contracts. There's someone you need to forgive, isn't there? Someone who hurt you in ways you're still carrying. And part of you doesn't want to forgive, because it feels like letting them off the hook. But forgiveness isn't about them. It's about you. It's about releasing the poison before it kills you. Your job isn't to carry the weight of someone else's sin. Your job is to lay it down, to give it to God, to choose freedom over bitterness. Joseph wept, and in his tears, in his embrace, he gave us a picture of what divine forgiveness looks like. Costly, painful, real, but also liberating, healing, life-giving. Word reached Pharaoh that Joseph's brothers had come, and Pharaoh was delighted. "Tell your brothers to bring your father and your families back to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt." So Joseph sent his brothers home with a message for their father. "God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay." And then, as they were preparing to leave, Joseph said something crucial. Don't quarrel on the way. He knew them, knew how guilt and shame can turn into blame. Joseph was giving them permission to leave the past in the past. The brothers traveled back to Canaan and stood before their father Jacob. Joseph is still alive. In fact, he is ruler of all Egypt. Jacob stared at them, still alive. His beloved son was alive. It was too much, too impossible. He didn't believe them at first, but then they told him everything, showed him the carts Joseph had sent, and slowly something shifted. "I'm convinced," he said, "my son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." So Jacob gathered his entire household, 70 people in all, and set out for Egypt, and God met him along the way. "Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you." When they arrived, Joseph prepared his chariot and went out to meet his father. Can you imagine? After all those years, father and son were about to see each other again. When Joseph saw his father, when his eyes found that familiar face now lined with age, he threw himself on Jacob and wept with the accumulated sorrow of a child torn from his parent. And Jacob held his son and said words that captured everything. "Now I am ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive." That's the power of restoration. Jacob had lived with the ache of Joseph's absence for decades, and now, impossibly, miraculously, Joseph was here. The wound that had defined his later years was finally healed. They settled in Goshen. Joseph provided for them, gave them the best land. And Jacob lived in Egypt for 17 more years. Years of restoration. Years of being reunited with the son he'd thought he'd lost forever. When Jacob's time came, he made Joseph promise something. "Do not bury me in Egypt. Carry me out and bury me where my fathers are buried." Even after years of blessing in Egypt, Jacob's heart was in Canaan, because Egypt wasn't home. So Joseph promised, and when Jacob died, Joseph mourned deeply and took him back to Canaan for burial. The brothers, watching this, grew afraid again. With their father dead, would Joseph's forgiveness hold? So they sent a message claiming Jacob had left instructions for Joseph to forgive them. And Joseph wept when he received this, wept because his brothers still didn't fully trust his forgiveness. When they came and said, "We are your slaves," Joseph responded with words that should be written on our hearts. "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Am I in the place of God?" That's the question that cuts through every desire for revenge. Who are you to judge? Your role is to forgive, to trust that God will handle justice, and then that profound truth. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. Both things are true simultaneously, human malice and divine purpose, intersecting in a way that brought salvation to many. Joseph lived to be 110 years old, and when his time came, he gathered his family and spoke final words. "I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised." Even at the end, even after all the success in Egypt, Joseph's eyes were on the promise, on Canaan, and he made them take an oath. "When God comes to your aid, you must carry my bones up from this place." He wanted to go home, even in death, because Egypt was never meant to be forever. It was a shelter during the storm, but the promise was somewhere else. Let your eyes close now. Let the story wash over you one last time. Joseph's life, from the pit to the palace, from betrayal to reconciliation. It's your story too. Maybe you're in the pit right now. Maybe you're waiting for promises that seem dead. But let Joseph's life speak to you. The pit isn't the end. The prison isn't forever. The betrayal isn't the final word. God is writing a bigger story, a story that takes all the broken pieces and weaves them into something beautiful. And if you're the one who's done the betraying, if you're carrying guilt and shame, let Joseph's forgiveness speak to you too. It's possible to be forgiven. It's possible to be restored. So bring your guilt, bring your shame, and lay them down. Let them go. Receive the forgiveness that's being offered. The end of the road of suffering, the place where all the pain and waiting finally leads. It's grace. It's always grace. The kind of grace that looks at betrayers and calls them brothers. The kind of grace that takes evil and transforms it into good. Rest now in that grace. Let it cover you like a blanket. Let it speak louder than your fear or your guilt or your disappointment. You are loved. You are held. You are being carried toward a future that will make sense of everything. Trust Him. Trust that at the end of every dark road, there's grace, there's restoration, there's a reunion with the joy you thought was lost forever. Sleep now, beloved. Your story isn't finished yet. The best chapters are still being written. God is with you, and He's going to see this through. The story ends with grace. It always does. That's God's way. That's His promise. That's your future. Amen.